How wild was life for women running businesses in 1172? Could a woman really make her own way when kings ruled and knights rode? And what secret struggles did she face just to keep her ale flowing or her looms humming? Number 9. Legal limitations and the shadow of coverture. Imagine trying to run a bustling business, say, a popular alehouse right on the edge of the market square in a busy English town, but not truly owning your own legal identity. That was the stark reality for many women in 1172, a world governed by ancient customs and emerging legal principles that often put them in a peculiar and precarious position. Concept often lurking in the background, though not always formalized with that exact word, was akin to what would later be known as coverture, where a married woman's legal existence was largely subsumed by that of her husband. She was in many ways an extension of him, especially concerning property and contracts. Consider the energetic Agnes, whose strong arms could stir the largest brewing vat and whose keen nose could detect the slightest off note in a batch of her famous mild ale. Alehouse the Thirsty Stag was a hub of village life, a place where farmers discussed harvests, merchants haggled over prices, and traveling minstrels might even stop for a pint and a song. Agnes managed everything from the buying of grain and hops to the brewing, the selling, and even the collection of debts. Yet if Agnes wanted to expand her business, perhaps by purchasing a small plot of land next door to build a new storeroom or a larger public space, she faced a significant hurdle. She couldn't, on her own, enter into a binding contract for land or a substantial loan. Any such agreement would ideally need her husband Thomas's consent, or even his direct participation. Thomas was away on a pilgrimage, or worse, if he had passed on, Agnes's ability to act independently in larger financial dealings became fraught with legal complexities and potential invalidation. Think about the implications of this for daily operations. If a supplier delivered a substandard batch of barley, could Agnes sue him for breach of contract? Theory perhaps, but the legal system of the time, still developing and heavily influenced by local custom and feudal allegiances, often required a woman to be represented by her husband. If he was unwilling, unable, or simply uninterested, Agnes's recourse might be limited to informal persuasion, or, at best, a lengthy and costly process that drained her already limited resources. Historians who pore over manorial court roles from this period, like those meticulous records kept by local lords, frequently note how women, when involved in legal disputes, are often cited as wife of husband's name, underscoring this legal dependency. It was not unheard of for a woman, particularly a widow, to conduct business and engage in legal action, but it was often on more precarious footing than a man, and her status could be easily challenged. The very assets Agnes relied upon, the copper brewing vessels, the wooden barrels, the very building of the Thirsty Stag itself, might technically belong to her husband or, more broadly, to the marital estate. If he incurred debts, her business could be seized to satisfy his creditors, even if she had managed it impeccably and profitably. This lack of independent legal standing meant that even a highly successful female entrepreneur was always operating under a sort of legal umbrella held by a male relative, leaving her vulnerable to decisions or misfortunes entirely outside of her control. It was a constant, gnawing worry for women like Agnes, who understood the daily grind of making a profit, but had little power to protect that profit from legal whims or misfortunes. Number 8. Societal expectations and the weight of gender roles. Imagine, for a moment, the bustling energy of a medieval village in 1172. Everyone knew their place, or so it seemed. The lord in his castle, the priest in his church, the farmer in his fields. For women, the proper place was often defined by the hearth in the home, a world of child rearing, food preparation, and household management. Stepping outside these deeply ingrained societal expectations to run a public business was not just physically demanding. It was a constant navigation of social judgment, whispered gossip, and unspoken disapproval. It was a challenge that could be as corrosive to a business as a bad harvest or a raiding party. Consider our friend Agnes, the spirited alewife. While brewing was considered a woman's domain within the home, a natural extension of household chores, turning it into a full-fledged commercial enterprise, especially one that involved dealing with all sorts of people in a public house, brought its own set of scrutinizing eyes. The alehouse was a place where men gathered, drank, and sometimes became rowdy. A woman who managed such a place might be viewed with suspicion. Was she neglecting her own children by spending so much time serving others? Was she too forward, too bold for a respectable woman? The very act of engaging with strangers, managing money, and asserting authority in a public sphere could brand a woman as unwomanly or even, God forbid, of loose morals. Take Alina, for instance, a talented weaver of fine woolen cloths in a thriving market town. Her skill was undeniable, her work sought after by local gentry. Yet, when Alina started selling her wares directly from her workshop, rather than having her husband act as the sole vendor, she began to notice a chill. Some village elders might murmur that she was too ambitious, that a woman's hands should be occupied with the spinning wheel at home, not with bargaining in the noisy market. The very act of a woman haggling over prices, setting terms, and demanding payment, skills essential for any successful merchant, could be perceived as unfeminine. Contemporary sermons and moral tracts, often preached from the local church pulpit, frequently reinforce the idea that women's virtues lay in domesticity, obedience, and quiet modesty. This constant pressure to conform to traditional gender roles impacted business in tangible ways. A woman running a business might find it harder to gain trust from male customers or suppliers, who might prefer to deal with a man, even if the woman was demonstrably more competent. The underlying assumption was often that a woman's business was merely a temporary stopgap, perhaps until her husband returned, or that she was simply assisting him, even if she was the true driving force. This invisible barrier, this social skepticism, could limit a woman's reach, her ability to expand, or even her basic legitimacy in the eyes of the community. It wasn't a legal code, but a social one, enforced by whispers, sidelong glances, and the subtle but persistent pressure to know one's place. For women like Agnes and Alina, success wasn't just about brewing good ale or weaving fine cloth. It was about doing so while constantly navigating the complex and often judgmental currents of medieval society's expectations for womanhood. Number 7, access to capital and the scarcity of financial resources. Picture a medieval economy in 1172, where wealth wasn't stored in banks or investment portfolios as we know them today. Instead, it was often tied up in land, livestock, or tangible goods. For a woman trying to start or expand a business, gaining access to this kind of capital was like trying to scoop water with a sieve, incredibly difficult and often fruitless. Pathways to financial resources were largely closed off to her, creating an uphill battle from the very start. Consider Matilda, a skilled baker known for her hearty loaves and sweet honey cakes. She dreams of upgrading her small, smoky oven to a larger, more efficient one that could bake more bread and cakes in a single firing, allowing her to serve more customers and increase her profits. This would require a significant investment in stone, mortar, and the labor of a skilled mason. Where would Matilda find such funds? Unlike a man, she likely couldn't simply put up a parcel of land as collateral for a loan. Land ownership for women, especially married women, was often complicated, if not outright impossible, without the involvement or consent of a male relative. While women could inherit land, control over it often reverted to their husbands upon marriage. Burgeoning financial institutions of the time, such as they were primarily geared towards men. Monasteries might lend money, but usually to powerful landowners or merchants with substantial assets. Guilds, nascent but growing in influence, sometimes provided financial support to their members, but as we will explore, women were often excluded from full guild membership. Wealthy individuals, if they lent money, would prefer to do so to those with clear legal standing and demonstrable assets, criteria that often disadvantaged women. Matilda's only recourse might be to borrow small sums from family or trusted neighbors, accumulating debts slowly and informally, which severely limited the scale of her ambitions. Let's return to Agnes, the alewife. To brew, she needed a consistent supply of barley, hops, and yeast, along with firewood to fuel her fires and a steady stream of fresh water. Buying these raw materials in bulk could secure better prices and ensure uninterrupted production. However, purchasing in bulk required immediate cash, which was often scarce. If the harvest was poor, the price of barley would skyrocket, and Agnes might need a larger sum than usual to keep her business afloat. Without access to formal credit or the ability to mortgage property, she might be forced to buy smaller, more expensive quantities, or worse, cease production altogether until conditions improved. The lack of financial independence was a constant vulnerability. A woman's personal savings, if she had any from her dowry or previous earnings, might be legally considered part of her husband's property. If her husband died, his assets, including those that supported her business, might be tied up in complex inheritance laws, leaving her without immediate access to the funds she needed to continue operations. Even if she was a widow and legally empowered to act, her pre-existing lack of independent financial standing meant she might have no track record or collateral to secure future loans. It was a vicious cycle. Without capital, a business struggled to grow. Without a growing business, it was impossible to accumulate the capital needed for stability and expansion. For these entrepreneurial women, every shilling earned was a hard-won battle, and every shilling needed for investment was an even greater one. Number 6, physical demands and the absence of support systems. Imagine a world in 1172 where every task, from grinding grain to drawing water, required immense physical exertion. Now layer onto that the constant demands of running a business, often without the modern conveniences we take for granted or the robust support networks that make juggling work and life possible today. For women entrepreneurs, this was a challenge of sheer endurance, where the body was pushed to its limits, often with little respite or assistance. Consider Agnes, our tireless alewife. Brewing ale was an incredibly labor-intensive process. It involved hauling heavy sacks of barley, often weighing more than a grown man, from the storehouse to the malt house. Barley then needed to be steeped, germinated, and kilned, processes that required constant attention and further physical handling. Then came the actual brewing, mashing the grains in huge wooden or copper vats, often stirring with a massive oar-like implement for hours over a roaring fire, the heat and steam intense. The liquid wort then needed to be separated, boiled again with hops, cooled, and finally fermented. Every step involved heavy lifting, continuous stirring, precise temperature control, often judged by hand, and endless cleaning of equipment. And this was just one part of her day. She also had to serve customers, manage inventory, collect payments, and keep the alehouse tidy. Now, add to this the reality of medieval life for women. Many, if not most, married women were also mothers, often with multiple young children. There were no daycare centers, no convenient schools to send children off to for the day. Childcare was a constant, integrated part of daily life. Pregnant alewife, perhaps in her third trimester, would still be expected to perform these arduous tasks or risk her business failing. Giving birth often meant only a short period of recovery before returning to the demanding rhythm of her trade. Imagine stirring a massive vat of boiling liquid while a toddler tugs at your skirt or an infant needs nursing. This was not an unusual scenario, it was the norm. Let's think about Bridget, who ran a successful laundry and fulling business by the river. Fulling, the process of cleaning and thickening wool cloth, involved trampling the cloth in large vats of water, often mixed with fuller's earth or even stale urine. This was incredibly strenuous work, often done with bare feet or by hand. Bridget would spend hours stooped over, manipulating heavy, wet cloth, her muscles aching, her hands raw. And like Agnes, Bridget also had to manage her household, cook meals, and care for her family without modern appliances. There were no washing machines, no hot running water, no vacuum cleaners. Every domestic chore was a physical undertaking. The lack of sophisticated healthcare was another critical missing support system. A serious illness or injury, whether to the woman herself or to a crucial family member or apprentice, could cripple a business. There were no sick days, no paid leave. Bridget fell ill, her business might grind to a halt, losing customers and income. If her husband or a key assistant became incapacitated, the entire burden would fall on her shoulders, adding further strain to an already physically demanding existence. For these industrious women of 1172, their own bodies were their primary tool, and the constant physical grind, coupled with the heavy weight of domestic responsibilities and the absence of any real support infrastructure, was a relentless and often exhausting challenge. Number 5, competition and the closed doors of male-dominated guilds. Imagine trying to succeed in a fiercely competitive market where the most powerful players have established exclusive clubs that largely shut you out. This was the reality for many women running businesses in 1172, as nascent guild systems began to form and consolidate power, often prioritizing and protecting male members while sidelining or entirely excluding women. Consider the vibrant, bustling guilds that were slowly emerging in England during the late 12th century. These were not just social clubs, they were powerful economic entities. They set standards for quality, controlled prices, regulated apprenticeships, and often held monopolies over certain trades within a town. If you were a man in a particular craft, joining a guild could mean access to valuable training, a network of contacts, shared resources, and a collective voice that could influence local authorities. For women, however, the doors were often locked, or at best, only slightly ajar. Take, for example, the highly skilled craft of tailoring or shoemaking. While women certainly stitched and made clothes, and many were skilled at mending and creating simple garments, the formal, lucrative trade was increasingly controlled by male guilds. A woman, even one with exceptional skill, might find herself unable to take on apprentices officially, unable to purchase raw materials at guild-negotiated bulk prices, and unable to market her goods through the guild's established channels. She might be forced to operate on the fringes, selling smaller quantities at lower prices, simply because she lacked the guild's stamp of approval or its collective bargaining power. Historical records, such as guild charters from later centuries, often explicitly state male-only membership, or limit female involvement to the wives or widows of masters, rarely as masters in their own right. Even in trades traditionally associated with women, like brewing, the rise of commercial production sometimes led to male dominance. While many women brewed ale for home consumption or small-scale sales, as brewing grew into a more formalized, larger-scale industry, men began to exert more control. Powerful brewers' guilds, though less established than some other crafts in 1172, would eventually emerge, and these too would often favor male members. Our alewife Agnes, while perhaps operating a successful business, would likely find herself outside any formal guild structure, or at best, treated as a secondary participant. This meant she would be vulnerable to male competitors who might have better access to capital, more political sway, or simply the advantage of being seen as more legitimate in the burgeoning professional marketplace. The exclusion from guilds wasn't just about prestige, it was about practical survival. Guilds could provide a form of social security, support in times of illness, and a collective defense against unfair taxation or arbitrary rulings. For women, denied these benefits, every setback was faced alone. They lacked the collective voice to advocate for their interests with local authorities or to protect themselves from unscrupulous competitors. This created a playing field that was far from level, forcing women entrepreneurs to constantly innovate and work harder just to keep pace with their male counterparts, who enjoyed the benefits of an organized, protective brotherhood. Number 4, reputation and the fragile nature of trustworthiness. Imagine living in a small, interconnected community where everyone knows everyone else's business. In 1172, your personal reputation was not just a matter of pride, it was the very bedrock of your economic survival. For women running businesses, particularly those in public-facing roles like alewives, maintaining an unblemished reputation was a constant, perilous tightrope walk. Any whisper of impropriety, any accusation of dishonesty, could shatter their livelihood overnight. Consider Agnes, the alewife at the Thirsty Stag. Her business relied entirely on the trust of her customers. They needed to believe her ale was of consistent quality, that her measures were honest, and that her prices were fair. But in a world without standardized weights and measures enforced by a large, centralized authority, and where quality control was often subjective, accusations of dishonesty could easily arise. Customer felt their pint was short, or that Agnes's latest batch tasted watery, a casual complaint could spread like wildfire through the village. Grumpy patron, perhaps after one too many drinks, might loudly declare that Agnes was a cheat. These accusations, even if unfounded, were incredibly difficult for a woman to refute effectively. A woman's reputation was often more vulnerable than a man's, largely due to prevailing societal biases. Women who engaged in public commerce were already, in some eyes, stepping outside their proper sphere. This made them easier targets for slander and gossip, which could be devastating. Agnes was perceived as too friendly with her male customers, or if she was seen gossiping too much, these purely social observations could morph into attacks on her character, which in turn would undermine the trustworthiness of her business. Medieval society often conflated a woman's moral character with her professional integrity, making any perceived flaw in one an immediate blow to the other. Let's look at Margaret, who ran a small but successful stall selling freshly baked bread and pastries in the town market. Her reputation depended on her bread being consistently light, well-baked, and made from good flour. However, if a batch went bad due to unexpected weather, or if a competitor maliciously spread a rumor that she was using stale grain, Margaret's sales could plummet. Unlike a man who might have a guild to defend his professional standing or powerful male connections to vouch for him, Margaret largely stood alone. Her defense against such rumors would likely be limited to personal appeals and the testimony of her loyal customers, a fragile shield against the relentless tide of gossip. The legal system offered little solace. While defamation was a recognized wrong, proving it and obtaining redress in a medieval court was a formidable challenge, especially for a woman. Often, fines were imposed on those who gave short measures, and these penalties could be severe, not just financially but also reputationally. An alewife caught watering down her ale might not only face a fine, but also public humiliation, such as being forced to pour her spoiled ale into the street. These public punishments were designed to shame and deter, but for a woman whose livelihood depended on her good name, they could be ruinous, making it almost impossible to regain public trust and attract customers. In 1172, a woman's good name was her most precious and most precarious business asset. Number 3, security and the perilous path of personal safety. Imagine having to conduct your business in a world where the rule of law was often sporadic and personal safety was far from guaranteed. For women entrepreneurs in 1172, the risks were multiplied, making simple tasks like transporting goods or handling cash a perilous undertaking. Limited avenues for effective legal recourse or robust protection, their daily lives were a constant negotiation with potential threats. Consider our alewife Agnes, who not only brewed and served ale, but also sourced her ingredients and sometimes even transported her finished product to nearby fairs or markets. Imagine her setting out from her village early in the morning, perhaps with a small cart loaded with kegs of her special brew, or simply walking with a purse full of coins to purchase a new supply of hops from a traveling merchant. The roads and paths outside the immediate confines of the village or town could be dangerous. Bandits and vagrants were a constant threat, and a lone woman, visibly engaged in commerce, would be seen as an easy target. Fear of robbery, assault, or worse, was a grim reality that women faced far more acutely than men, who could often rely on their physical strength or the company of other men for protection. The alehouse itself, while a place of commerce and community, also presented security challenges for Agnes. As a public house, it attracted all manner of people, some of whom might be drunk, rowdy, or unscrupulous. She would need to manage disputes, deal with unruly patrons, and ensure the safety of her premises and her family, often without the direct support of a male protector. If a fight broke out, or if someone tried to steal from her cash box, Agnes would largely be on her own to defuse the situation or defend her property. The local watch, if one existed, was likely small and ineffective, and calling upon the Lord's men for every minor disturbance was impractical. Let's think about Sarah, who specialized in selling poultry and eggs in the market. Every market day, she would have to transport live chickens or fragile eggs from her farm, often a significant distance. The journey itself was risky, but then came the market environment itself, crowded, chaotic, and ripe for petty theft or aggressive bargaining that could turn ugly. Sarah, burdened with her goods, would be vulnerable to pickpockets or intimidation. Unlike male merchants who might travel in groups or be armed, women rarely had such protections. And if a dispute arose over payment or quality, a woman might be physically intimidated with little recourse. The legal framework of the time offered little comfort. While violent crime was punishable, securing justice could be a lengthy and uncertain process, requiring evidence and witnesses, which were often hard to come by. For a woman, reporting such a crime might even lead to further scrutiny or social disapproval. The concept of personal security, particularly for a woman conducting business, was largely her own responsibility, a burden that added immense stress and restricted her movements and opportunities. It was a constant reminder that for women entrepreneurs in 1172, every business transaction, every journey, and every interaction carried an undercurrent of potential danger. Number 2, limited education and the gap in business training. Imagine trying to run a business in 1172 without the ability to read or write, or without any formal training in accounting, market analysis, or contract negotiation. For many women entrepreneurs, this was a significant hurdle. While practical skills were passed down through generations, the structured education and business acumen that could propel a venture forward were largely reserved for men. Consider our diligent alewife, Agnes. She learned to brew from her mother, a skill passed down through generations of women in her family. She knew the feel of the barley, the smell of the fermenting wort, the exact moment the ale was ready. This was an invaluable practical education, honed through years of observation and hands-on experience. But what if Agnes wanted to expand her enterprise beyond the local village? What if she needed to manage more complex accounts, track larger quantities of raw materials, or deal with suppliers from distant towns who might demand written agreements? Formal education in 1172, typically conducted in Latin and focused on religious texts, law, or logic, was almost exclusively for boys and men, especially those destined for the clergy, nobility, or the emerging merchant class. Women, even those of wealthier families, might learn basic literacy, but advanced arithmetic, record-keeping, and the intricacies of commercial law were usually beyond their reach. This lack of formal training meant that women entrepreneurs often operated on a more intuitive, informal basis. They might keep mental tallies of sales and expenses, or rely on simple notches on a stick for counting. While this sufficed for small, local dealings, it severely limited their ability to scale up, analyze profitability, or detect fraud. Imagine a male merchant, having learned basic arithmetic and perhaps even some Roman numerals, meticulously tracking his inventory and debts in a ledger. He would have a clearer picture of his financial health and be better equipped to make strategic decisions. Agnes, relying on memory and trust, would be at a distinct disadvantage when dealing with more sophisticated male traders. Let's think about Isabel, who specialized in making and selling simple garments and hats. She was an excellent seamstress, quick with a needle, and had a good eye for what the common folk needed. However, when it came to calculating costs for larger orders, understanding fluctuating wool prices, or negotiating bulk deals with suppliers, she relied on approximation and intuition rather than precise calculations. This could lead to missed opportunities for profit or, worse, unintended losses. While male apprentices learned their trade through structured arrangements, often involving literacy and numeracy alongside practical skills, women's training was typically informal and domestic, focusing on the immediate needs of the household and community. The information divide was also a significant barrier. Written records of market trends, prices in distant towns, or new commercial practices were largely inaccessible to women who couldn't read or lacked access to such documents. This meant they were often operating with less complete information, making them more susceptible to price manipulation or missing out on profitable opportunities. For women like Agnes and Isabel, their innate talent and practical knowledge were immense, but the lack of formal business education was a silent, persistent handicap, limiting their growth and increasing their vulnerability in the competitive medieval marketplace. Number 1, taxation and regulation without representation. Imagine running your business, paying your dues, and following all the rules, only to find yourself at the mercy of arbitrary decisions made by powerful men who neither understand nor represent your interests. This was the harsh reality for women running businesses in 1172. They were subject to various forms of taxation and regulation, but had absolutely no say in their imposition or the laws that governed their very livelihoods. It was a profound lack of voice in a world where power resided almost exclusively with men. Consider Agnes, the alewife, who was a reliable source of income for the local lord and the king. Ale was a staple drink, and its production was often taxed. Agnes would pay a brew tax, perhaps a fixed amount per batch or a levy based on the quantity sold. These taxes, often collected by the lord's bailiff or the king's sheriff, were not open to negotiation or discussion. They were simply imposed. If the lord decided he needed more funds for a new castle wall or to equip his knights, he might suddenly increase the brew tax or impose a new levy on the purchase of barley. Agnes would have no recourse, no avenue to appeal, and no collective body to represent her interests as a brewer. This vulnerability extended beyond direct taxation. Local markets, where many women sold their goods, were regulated by officials appointed by the lord or the town council. These officials could set rules about market hours, the type of goods sold, and even the prices. For instance, the assize of bread and ale, an early form of price control, would set maximum prices for these staples based on the price of grain. While intended to prevent gouging, it also meant that a woman like Agnes or Margaret, the baker, might be forced to sell her goods at a price that barely covered her costs, even if the price of her raw materials had increased. She had no seat on the council that decided these prices, no opportunity to explain her rising expenses, and no voice in shaping the regulations that directly impacted her bottom line. Think about the various fees women might incur just to operate. There might be stall fees in the market, tolls for using certain roads or bridges to transport goods, or even specific fines for perceived infringements. For instance, if Agnes's ale was deemed to be of substandard quality, she might face a fine imposed by the ale taster, an official whose word was often final. These fines could be arbitrary, and the process of appealing them was often complex, costly, and stacked against a woman with limited legal standing. The lack of representation meant that women entrepreneurs were often overlooked or actively disadvantaged in official decisions. Male merchants might form powerful groups that could lobby the local lord or town council for favorable terms, access to resources, or protections from competition. Women, largely excluded from such formal power structures and unable to vote or hold public office, had no such collective voice. They were simply subjects to be taxed and regulated, without the corresponding right to participate in the governance that shaped their economic lives. It was a world where men made the rules, and women, despite their vital contributions to the economy, were left to navigate a system designed without their input, making every shilling earned not just a testament to their hard work, but also to their resilience in the face of systemic powerlessness.